It was late at night when my old desk phone started ringing. That shrill noise echoed through the silent house like a scream from another world. I hesitated for a second. No one called me anymore. My friends are long gone, and my daughter only remembers me when she needs favors. But that number. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't from my town. It wasn't safe. And yet, something inside me made me answer. There was no one on the other end of the line. Just silence. But then, as if in a fright, the phone emitted Abapand. A recording automatically started playing. It was like a WhatsApp audio, only straight from the afterlife. And what I heard destroyed everything I still held dear to my heart. It was them. My daughter Claire. David, my son-in-law. And Emily, my granddaughter. My girl, my heart. They were together. Talking as if it were any ordinary dinner. Laughing. Making plans. Unaware that I was listening. Unaware that connection shouldn't exist. She'll never find out, Claire said in a whisper that still sends shivers down my spine. And even if I do, it's too late, David replied, with the same coldness as someone throwing away something old. Emily's voice, my little one, came last. If she finds out, everything falls apart. Everything. What? My body froze. My heart raced. Time stood still in that dark room as I clutched the phone with trembling hands. Those voices. Those words. They weren't just words. They were knives. Knives thrown by the one I loved most in this world. And that's when I realized, they didn't know. They didn't know I was listening. And worse, they didn't know where I was listening from. Because at that moment, I no longer existed for them. I in their minds. I was already dead. But I was alive. Alone, yes. Wounded, too. But alive. And when a woman like me, who gave her life for her family, discovers she's been betrayed, something changes. I felt the blood flow differently in my veins. The pain became something else. It became a silent strength. One certainty. I needed to know the truth. And when I did, they would understand what it means to disrespect a woman who survived everything. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a confession. It's a confession. And, above all, it's the story of a turnaround they never expected. By the way, before I tell you what happened after that audio, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Because if you have a mother, a grandmother, or have ever felt the bitter taste of ingratitude, you'll understand exactly what I felt. And if you think you've heard stories of family betrayal, you haven't heard this one. I didn't turn off the phone that night. I held on tight. Every word, every comma, etched in my mind. Because in that moment, I knew my life would never be the same again. And that was exactly when everything started to change. Before all this, before the call, the discovery, the pain that still throbs deep in my chest, I was just Grandma Dorothy. Not Dorothy, the betrayed woman. Nor Dorothy, the figure in a tragic story. Just Dorothy, a 78-year-old woman, with weak knees and a heart full of memories. I was the one who got up early every day, even when she didn't need to. My body couldn't keep up as much, but my soul. Oh, my soul insisted on serving. On being useful. On being needed. I woke up at 6. I always made a point of making coffee the way my mother taught me. Calmly, in silence, enjoying the smell of toasting bread, the sound of the kettle heating the milk. It gave me a sense of order. A false sense of control. Then I washed the dishes, organized Claire's kitchen as if it were my own, and waited for the sound of Emily's bedroom door. When she came in, still sleepy, and gave me that half smile, it all made sense. It was for her that I endured David's veiled contempt. It was for her that I swallowed my daughter's harsh words, pretending not to understand when she called me invasive or clueless. But what no one knew was what was going on behind the scenes. What no one saw was how my presence gradually became a nuisance. At first, I only heard random things. Cutting comments said jokingly, "Don't touch my pots, Mom, this isn't your house," Claire would say, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Or David, always so polite to others, but at home. He looked at me as if I were an old piece of furniture no one knew where to put. Still, I kept going. Because in my mind, that was my role. I'm from the generation that learned to love by serving. To show affection by putting food on the table, making other people's beds, listening without being heard. And you know what? I didn't care. Because I saw purpose in it. In my mind, that routine was my mission. It was what kept me going. Emily loved it when I told her bedtime stories. She'd curl up on my lap, and I'd tell her about the legends of my childhood, the hard times I'd lived with my father working 3 jobs to put food on the table. And yet, she always asked for more. It warmed my heart. Because there, with her head in my lap and her eyes shining, I still felt like I had an impact. That my existence still had meaning. But little by little, even that was fading away. Claire stopped letting me pick up Emily from school. She said it was dangerous, that I was getting confused about the schedule. I knew it wasn't true. I'd always been organized. But I accepted it. David started locking doors, hiding papers, and quickly putting away envelopes when I entered the classroom. Once, I saw them whispering in the hallway, and upon seeing me, they changed the subject suspiciously quickly. Still, I kept quiet. Pretending not to see was easier than asking and hearing what I already feared. Over time, I lost my place. First, they removed my chair from the living room. Then, my photos from the bookshelf. The pots and pans I used mysteriously disappeared. Even my favorite blanket vanished. They said it was my fault, that I was forgetting things. But I knew. I felt it. It's strange how, even living in the same house, we can become ghosts. Present, yet invisible. Useful, yet unwanted. And it hurts in a silent way. It's not a scream. It's an erosion. A daily erosion of self-esteem, presence, and identity. And then comes the cruelest part of this journey. When you start to believe that maybe the problem is you. Maybe I was really meddling too much. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should just disappear. But that's precisely where the danger of certain decisions lies. Because when a woman begins to believe she's no longer needed, that's when she rebuilds herself in silence. And it was precisely in that silence that the truth began to emerge. The connection was still playing in my head days after it happened. That recording, with the voices of those I loved most, echoed like a raw scar in every thought. I heard Claire's restrained laugh, David's measured tone, and it tore at me more than any physical illness could. It wasn't just what was said, it was what weight of what was implied. What was behind. That hidden truth that never had the courage to show itself. Until now. The first time, I listened to that audio in shock. The second time, my heart pounded. The third time, in absolute silence, searching for every pause, every sigh, like someone examining the details of a deep wound. The phrase that struck me most came whispered, like a secret between accomplices. She's too old to understand. Too old. What do you mean? It was that phrase that opened the crack in my soul. It wasn't just ingratitude. It was disdain. It was a hidden, cruel mentality I never imagined resided within my own daughter. They were talking about me as if I were an obstacle, a problem, a burden. As if my existence was something to be circumvented, ignored. And the worst was yet to come. David, in a cold, almost bureaucratic tone, replied, "If she finds out what we did, everything falls apart." At that moment, my breath caught. My body froze. What did we do? What exactly did they do? What kind of decisions did they make behind my back? What revelations lay hidden beneath that facade of a functional family? It was as if I'd suddenly been transported backstage to a play where I thought I was the star. But in reality, I was just scenery. This recording wasn't just audio. It was an involuntary confession. A map of lies that I now needed to decipher. And I knew I couldn't ask them directly. If I revealed I knew, they would cover their tracks, hide what they were doing, maybe even push me away altogether. So, for the first time in a long time, I decided to play their game, but by my own rules. Pain had become attention. Humiliation had become strategy. I needed to understand, without being noticed. Like someone who observes silently, but records everything. Because there, in that moment, a new version of me was born. It was hard to continue my routine after that. Looking at Claire and pretending to be normal. Listening to David make jokes at breakfast and not responding with tears in his eyes. They laughed, talked about the soap opera, talked about Emily's school. And there I was, sitting at the same table, with an entire universe collapsing inside me. I thought about the trust I'd given, the life I'd dedicated, and how everything was being tainted by a secret I still didn't fully understand. But even without knowing exactly what it was, I felt the impact. Because betrayal, sometimes, doesn't come from a direct stab. It comes from a series of small lies, silent decisions, averted glances, hidden papers, whispers in the hallway. I began to observe them both with different eyes. I began to notice how Claire always avoided letting me be alone with the mail. How David never left his computer screen unlocked. And how Emily, even without understanding anything, seemed less relaxed around me. As if someone had told her I was sick or forgetful. It broke my heart in a way only a grandmother could understand. But I needed to keep a cool head. I couldn't let myself get carried away by emotion. Not yet. It was time to understand what was at stake. Because if they were hiding something so serious, something that would tear everything apart if I found out, then I had more power than I'd imagined. And this was new to me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just the lady of the house. I was the key to a secret. The piece they couldn't control. And this shift in perspective was like a breath of clarity. I was still alive. And more than that, I was awake. No one noticed the transformation. They thought I was quieter because I was sad. Maybe they thought I was depressed, disoriented. But in reality, I was paying attention. Calculating every step. Paying attention to the details. I began writing down conversations. Observing reactions. Reviewing my own old documents, forgotten bills, old receipts, bank letters. Anything that could lead me to the truth. Because I knew, when I found what they were hiding, the story would change completely. And not just for me. It was more than just a matter of money or property. It was about dignity. About identity. About reclaiming my voice. And, above all, it was about protecting my legacy, not of possessions but of memory, of values, of truth. And it was in this state of attention and silence that a detail began to catch my attention. Something small, almost imperceptible, but which, if confirmed, could be the tip of the thread that would lead to this whole plot. It was soon after that day that my body gave out. I don't know if it was the weight of the discovery or the accumulation of everything I'd kept silent for so long, but my chest tightened in a different way. I was left breathless. My knees buckled, and I woke up in an ambulance, with a stranger asking me if I knew my name. I remember answering, "Dorothy," my voice choked, my head fuzzy, but my heart perfectly clear. It was as if my body was begging for a break, while my mind screamed for answers. Claire appeared at the hospital with the sweet voice of someone who never raised a hand, but with the icy eyes of someone who's already made up her mind for you. She told me I needed to rest. That I couldn't take care of myself at home anymore. That it was all for my own good. At that moment, I was too weak to react. I just nodded, trying to understand what she meant by retreat. A retreat. That was the word she used. But the place they took me was less of a retreat and more of an isolation. It wasn't a hospital. Nor was it a conventional nursing home. It was one of those remote centers, smelling of disinfectant and hallways too long for those who've lost their way. The room was cold, unadorned, without curtains, without a single picture. The silence was so thick it seemed to fill the spaces between the furniture. When I asked when I'd be returning home, the receptionist said it wasn't up to me. That didn't make sense. I didn't sign anything. They didn't explain anything to me. They just put me there, with a bag of clothes and a packet of pills labeled with my name. For the first few days, I thought Claire would come visit. That she would bring Emily, or at least call. But time passed, and all that arrived was silence. Silences that looked abandoned. Silences that screamed, "Stay there. Forget. Accept." And it was there, in that white, lifeless room, that I began to suspect that this retreat was, in fact, an exile. They weren't caring for me. They were hiding me. Each morning, I expected to hear my granddaughter's voice echoing down the hallway, but all I heard were the hurried footsteps of nurses and the distant sound of low-volume televisions. Meals were left at the door. The phone only worked for internal calls. The windows had thin, barely noticeable, but real bars. It was clean but soulless. Safe but devoid of warmth. A limbo between life and oblivion. And it was there that I began to connect the dots. One of the employees, a young man with a kind gaze and little knack for disguising the truth, inadvertently let slip that my daughter had signed a legal liability waiver. He said that, according to the document, I needed supervision, that I was in cognitive decline. It hit me like a thunderbolt. Because, despite everything, my mind had never been clearer. Just now, when I was most awake, most aware, most determined, they were putting me there. As if I were a threat. It was all a ploy. A decision made for convenience. They weren't looking out for me. They were silencing me. Slowly extinguishing me, like someone blowing out a candle so as not to disturb the dinner. But even there, in that white room, my mind was still racing. I began to search everything around me. I wanted to understand exactly what had happened to my documents, my bank account, my rights. I asked the nurse to bring me my bag, but he said it was with the responsible family. I asked for my old medications, and he said they had been replaced with new protocols. I asked to speak to my daughter, and he said she preferred not to disturb me. "Don't agitate me." The phrase sounded like a sentence. As if my emotions were no longer their responsibility. As if my pain were an unwanted noise in their story. It was at that moment that I understood. Either I made a decision, or they would leave me there until the end of my days, voiceless, choiceless, nameless. And the cruelest thing of all is that, to the world's eyes, it looked like care. It looked like protection. But the truth was different. They didn't want me to ask questions. They didn't want me to have access to anything. They wanted me to keep quiet. They wanted me to believe that being there was what was best for me. But my mind, the same one they said was failing, was more alive than ever. And it was there, in the midst of that forced silence, that a memory came back to me with a vengeance. A detail I'd almost overlooked. Something they'd told me years ago. A name. A piece of information. A small mistake they'd made. But which, if confirmed, could unravel everything they were trying to hide. That morning, something seemed off. The sky was grey as usual, and the hallway reeked of that constant smell of cleaning products that seemed to want to erase the identity of everything. But there was a different sound. A muffled conversation, coming from the administrative wing. The doors in that place were always ajar, as if the building itself had a habit of whispering secrets. I was sitting in the armchair in the reading room, which was rarely used by anyone but me, when I heard it. Two voices. One male, firm. The other female, hurried. They exchanged information coldly, almost as if discussing a lost object. But hadn't that account been closed? No, it's still active, just with sporadic movements. The last withdrawal was made by Claire. Did Dorothy sign? Technically, yes. But the document was brought by the daughter. It was all very straightforward. My heart raced. I forced myself to breathe slowly, as if I couldn't hear anything. But inside, I trembled. This was proof that something very wrong was happening. And I knew in that instant that my name had been used. That bank account was an inheritance from my late husband. It was something we kept reserved for emergencies, for Emily's education, for a future that now felt stolen. I returned to my room as if nothing had happened, but my thoughts screamed. The words, technically, yes, kept hammering in my head. This was the kind of breach that destroys entire structures. It was the revelation of a mistake. A slip-up that exposed the hidden truth behind the carefully constructed farce. In that moment, I understood that this story wasn't just about family contempt. It was a conspiracy. A sequence of decisions made in the shadow of my trust. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the creaking of the ancient structure, as if the building itself was warning me, "You need to get out of here." And the more I thought about it, the more everything fell into place. The haste with which I was admitted, the isolation, the restricted access to my belongings. It wasn't care. It was control. The kind of control that silences, that erases, that slowly empties a person's identity until they doubt themselves. I no longer had any doubts. What they'd done to me had been meticulously planned. And now, with this information about the account, I knew where the weak link lay. The mistake they never imagined I'd hear. But I did. And that changed everything. The next morning, I asked to go to the garden. It was something few residents asked for, so the staff didn't see a problem. It was the only time of day I had any freedom, albeit under surveillance from a distance. But that day, I went with a different purpose. I observed the exits, the gates, the cameras. I did what I've done my whole life. I analyzed in silence. No one there knew, but the quiet lady in the wheelchair was, at that moment, the most attentive woman in the place. And that's when I made the decision. I was going to get out of there. With or without help. Through the front door, if possible. Or through the back door, if necessary. I wasn't going to allow the narrative of my life to be written by those who erased me. Not after everything I'd been through. Everything I'd discovered. Not when I was so close to getting back what was mine. Not just the money, but the truth, the respect, my story. Over the next few days, I began testing the limits. I asked about schedules. About protocols. About names. I pretended to be weaker so they'd let their guard down. Or, more distracted, so they'd trust me. It all stemmed from a new mindset. It was no longer about revenge. It was about justice. About rebuilding. About the impact a courageous decision can have, even after years of silence. And it was on one of those days, a grey late afternoon, with the sky reflecting exactly what I felt inside, that something happened. A detail. A shift change. A forgotten key. A new employee who didn't know my background. A moment of carelessness that, for me, meant an open window. It was the chance I needed. The escape point. And it was there, with my makeshift bag in hand, my papers hidden deep in my coat, and my heart pounding faster than ever, that I took my first step toward freedom. Because this story, which they tried to erase, was just beginning to be told. I didn't know exactly where to go. I only knew I couldn't stay any longer. Every step outside those walls was a risk, yes, but the greatest risk of all was remaining there, invisible, surrounded by clean walls and dirty hearts. My feet ached, my body felt heavy, but my mind, oh, my mind was more alive than ever. That escape wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual. It was my scream. My silent refusal to accept the role I'd been assigned. I wasn't the burden. I was the pillar. I walked as far as I could until I found a small bus station, where I begged for help like someone begging for air. A man offered to accompany me to a simple hotel nearby. When I found myself alone in the room, with a creaky bed and a small tube television, I cried for the first time in weeks. But it wasn't a cry of defeat. It was like opening a dam. It was a release from years of being silenced, underestimated, manipulated. I was alone, but for the first time free. It was there, on that cold dawn, that I decided to revisit something I'd kept for a long time. An object my daughter might not even remember still existed. My husband's old diary. Not the one with sentimental notes, but that worn notebook he kept hidden in the top of the closet, along with old documents and records. At the time, he'd said it was just guy stuff. Bills, insurance, inventory. But deep down, I always knew there was more there. And because he trusted me, he left clues. Tiny, but intentional. With the help of a kind taxi driver who took me to my old house, where, ironically, I no longer lived, I managed to retrieve a box I had left with a trusted friend many years earlier, when we moved into Claire's house. "Can you hold this for me? It's important. I just want to keep it out of sight," I said at the time, unaware of how much that gesture would save me in the future. When I opened the box, my heart almost stopped. There was the diary. Yellowed, with signs of use, but intact. Inside, organized with the discipline of a man who never trusted banks much, were detailed notes about a joint account he had opened in my name. The statements, secured with rusty paper clips, showed regular deposits. There were also copies of the will, drafts with handwritten notes, and a letter with my initial on the envelope. The letter. That shaky handwriting. That was him. He was there with me, even after so long. I opened it slowly, and what I read tore me apart. "Dorothy, if you're ever reading this, it's because something went wrong. I want you to know that I trusted you with everything. Not Claire. Not David. You. This account is yours, and so is the will. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. You've always been the lifeblood of this family." I took a deep breath. My chest felt like it wanted to explode, not just with emotion, but with justice. This was all I needed. Living proof that he wasn't losing his mind. That my intuition, the one so often discredited because it came from an old woman, had been right all along. And now I had not only the truth, but the tools. I started putting the puzzle together. Among the papers, I found recent transfers with Claire's digital signature. The signature was imperfect, hesitant, as if it had been done in a hurry. What's more, there was a series of withdrawals made shortly after my hospitalization. This couldn't be a coincidence. They waited until I was out of the picture to act. They knew that, without me, no one would question it. That old Dorothy would be just another confused old woman in some rehab center. But no. I was here. And now, armed with evidence. With names. With dates. In that moment, it wasn't just about getting the money back. It was about reclaiming my position. My identity. My voice. It was about redefining everything they tried to strip from me, including my own narrative. For the first time, Claire wasn't controlling the story. It was me, rewriting what they'd tried to erase. My head was racing. I began to write everything down calmly, just as he did. I listed the documents, organized the copies, catalogued the dates. Every detail mattered. I knew that to turn this around, I would need more than emotion. I would need intelligence. And strategy. I took a deep breath, adjusted the journal beside me, and stared at the ceiling with a new calm. A serenity only those who have been through fire can feel. Because there, sitting on that old, cheap hotel bed, I understood that my journey was just beginning. And that with each step from then on, I would be closer to reclaiming not only what was mine, but also what no one should ever have dared to try to steal. Being seen again after so long being invisible is like relearning to walk. Each step requires firmness, and every choice carries a new depth. I was in a simple room, with a small suitcase at the foot of the bed, but I felt bigger than ever. For the first time in many years, I wasn't someone asking to be heard. I was someone determined to speak, and to be taken seriously. Because dignity, when reclaimed, becomes a weapon. And in that moment, I was armed with memory, documents, and, above all, purpose. I started looking for someone I truly trusted, and the first name that came to mind was Pastor Michael. He'd known me since Claire was little. He'd seen me serve coffee to church members, organize church fairs, and pray with those who suffered in silence. He was a calm man who knew how to listen slowly and offer counsel without intruding. I called from a payphone, and upon hearing my voice, he answered as if he already knew. "Dorothy, where are you? Your daughter said you were missing." I took a deep breath, without anger. Just clearly. I explained everything, from audio recordings to bank statements. And for the first time, someone listened to me without question. We met at the church office the next day. He greeted me with a firm hug and introduced me to a close friend, a trusted attorney, Mr. Harris. A calm man with watchful eyes and a slow voice, I showed him everything I had found. My husband's letter, the will, the financial records. He read them carefully, unhurriedly, as if he understood he was dealing with something bigger than mere paperwork. When he finished, he looked up and said, "This changes everything. And you have every right to act." It wasn't just a legal issue. It was a matter of emotional justice. I knew I couldn't recover the lost years, nor the words that were never said, but I could protect my name, my story, and what remained of my inheritance, not just material but moral. With Mr. Harris's help, we began to gather everything necessary to prove that the signatures had been forged, that the interdiction process had been based on lies, and that my daughter and son-in-law had acted in bad faith. Pastor Michael accompanied me to every meeting, giving me strength in moments when exhaustion almost got the better of me. But I resisted. Because there was something greater than the pain. There was dignity. And dignity can't be bought or stolen. It can only be regained with courage. As the legal action began to take shape, something inside me also began to reorganize. It was as if the woman I'd been my whole life was returning to her own body. Not with arrogance, but with quiet strength. A strength that doesn't scream, but doesn't bend. I walked the streets with my head held high, even though I didn't yet know how this story would end. Because, somehow, I had already won. People saw me and smiled. Some said, "It's good to see you here again," as if I'd gone on vacation. But I knew. I knew that every small step out of that emotional prison was a cry for freedom. And even if no one knew what was going on behind the scenes, I carried the truth with me. And that was my greatest protection. In one of my meetings with Pastor Michael, he said something I've never forgotten. "Dorothy, sometimes God allows us to be pushed to the depths just to show us that even from there, He lifts us up." And that was exactly what I was experiencing. A slow but profound transformation. A change of mindset. I was no longer the woman who accepted everything in the name of peace. Now, I was the woman who understood that peace without truth is silence. And silence, when imposed, is prison. Mr. Harris said we could soon officially file a request to review the will and open an investigation into the improper withdrawals. The evidence was clear. The law was on our side. And more than that, my story was rewriting itself out loud. I knew it wouldn't be easy. That Claire would fight back. That David would try to turn things around. But this time, I had more than suspicions. I had evidence. I had faith. I had real people around me. And, above all, I had a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. It was in this context, amid documents, calm conversations, and firm decisions, that an idea began to take shape. A way to reveal this whole truth not only in court, but before those who also deserved to know. Because this story, which so many tried to hide, was about to emerge from the darkness. And the world needed to hear my voice. The news began to circulate tentatively, like barely suppressed whispers in church hallways and grocery store lines. First, it was a small article in the local newspaper, then a brief mention on a community radio station, until, in less than 2 weeks, it spread. Mrs. Dorothy's daughter was being investigated for misuse of documents, financial fraud, and forged signatures in legal proceedings involving family assets. Her son-in-law, once seen as the level-headed man of the family, was now being named in bank investigations. The mask slipped, and it slipped in a way no one expected. I found out from a neighbor, one of those who always knows everything before everyone else. She called me in tears, saying she never would have imagined something like that coming from Claire. I thanked her for her kindness, but inside, I confess, I felt a silence. A kind of relief that doesn't scream. It was as if every layer of the truth was finally coming to light. And I didn't need to make a fuss or seek revenge. I just needed to exist, steadfastly, calmly, and with the truth on my side. The repercussions were greater than we expected. The lawyer received requests from the press, Claire's friends stopped answering her calls, and even distant family members, who previously blindly believed her stories about me, began to reconsider their judgments. Not because I asked them to, but because reality, when laid bare, speaks louder than any well-told lie. Claire tried to react. She posted a dramatic message on social media, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that I was being manipulated, that my mental health was compromised. But this time, no one believed her. People saw the desperation behind her words. An attempt to reverse the role, to play the victim. But it was too late. The evidence was recorded, the documents authenticated, the facts indisputable. It was impossible to hide the mud once it had already spilled through the cracks. David, on the other hand, disappeared. He stopped going out, quit his job, and according to rumors, which reached me without my asking, he was being pressured by people he himself had deceived. Apparently, the case with my account wasn't the only one. And, as they say, when the truth begins to unravel, it takes with it everything built on top of it. But what surprised me was Emily's reaction. One day, I received a letter written in blue pen on notebook paper. She said she'd overheard her mother talking and didn't understand why I wasn't around anymore. She fondly recounted the bedtime stories I'd made up and asked if I'd done something wrong. That broke me. Because, in the midst of the chaos, she was the one suffering the most, without understanding. A girl in the eye of the storm, tossed from one side to the other by decisions that were never hers. I showed the letter to Pastor Michael, and he, with his usual calm, said, "You have to decide how far you'll go. Sometimes, the downfall of others doesn't have to be our victory. Sometimes, justice isn't about destroying, but about rebuilding with wisdom." Those words resonated with me. Because they were true. I didn't want to destroy Claire, nor see David humiliated. I wanted them to know what they had done. I wanted them to understand the impact of their decisions. I wanted them to see, once and for all, that aging isn't the same as disappearing. That being a mother, being a grandmother, doesn't make us anyone's property. That the love we gave, even when it was ignored, was valuable. And it was in this climate of silent exposure, where those who had humiliated me began to face the reflection of their own choices, that I felt something reborn within me. A kind of balance. As if life, over time, put each piece in its place. And I, who had been marginalized for so long, now saw everything from the outside, with a clear and firm gaze. Without shouting, without taking revenge, simply remaining. Firm. Present. Unbeatable. The messages that began arriving from other women, other mothers, other grandmothers, showed me that this wasn't just my story. It was the story of many. Stories buried in silence, hidden behind forced smiles at Sunday dinners. Stories of unrequited love, of unrecognized sacrifice, of betrayed loyalty. And each one echoed within me like confirmation. My pain, transformed into truth, had become a bridge to other liberations. And it was in this scenario, with truths exposed, masks fallen, and bridges being rebuilt, that a new idea began to germinate. An idea that united everything I had experienced up until that point. Something that was no longer just about me, but about all of us who, at some point, have been forgotten by those we should call family. She arrived unannounced. She simply appeared, like someone carrying a weight they no longer know where to hide. Claire's face was drawn, her eyes sunken, her makeup gone, and she lacked that controlled posture she always wore like armor. She knocked on the door slowly, as if the sound she'd made might awaken some monster she'd helped create. I saw her through the window before she even knocked. My heart, which was no longer frightened by much, raced as if for the first time. For a moment, I considered not opening the door. Not out of anger. That was over. But out of protection. Because, after all, I had learned that forgiveness without limits becomes repetition. But something inside me told me this meeting had to happen. I took a deep breath and turned the doorknob. I said nothing. I just left the door ajar. She entered silently, as if each step were too heavy to carry. She sat down in the living room chair as if she had nowhere else to run. And then, finally, she spoke. "Mom, I was wrong. I can't justify it. I'm just ashamed." Her voice was weak, but sincere. For the first time, there was no pretense. There was no superiority. There was humanity. And pain. She cried. She cried with her face in her hands, like a child who has broken something precious and knows there's no way to mend it. I remained silent. Not out of coldness, but out of respect for the truth. Because there are pains we can't ease. There are regrets that must be endured in silence. And in that moment, silence was my most honest gesture. After a few minutes, she looked at me with red eyes and said, "I just wanted you to understand. I was lost. Scared. I thought you would end up sick, that I would have to take care of everything alone. I couldn't handle it. But none of that justifies what I did. And what David did was even worse. I let him." It was the first time I'd heard my daughter admit responsibility without shifting blame, without trying to smooth over her own mistakes. It touched me, but it also reminded me of the wound that still throbbed. I gripped the edges of the chair tightly, looked her in the eye, and replied with the calm that only the truth can give. "Claire, you lied to me, thinking I would never know. But God always reveals what needs to be revealed." She closed her eyes, as if those words were a sentence. But I continued. Not to hurt her, but to make it clear that my love wasn't synonymous with blindness. "You treated me like a burden. You erased me from the places in my own life. You made decisions for me as if I were already gone. And yet, I'm here. Because what you tried to take from me, God restored in courage." She nodded, lowering her head. I saw something in her I hadn't seen in a long time. Humility. Not the kind that apologizes and moves on as if nothing had happened, but the kind that acknowledges, feels the impact, and wants to understand what to do with the broken pieces. "I didn't come here to ask you for anything, Mom. I just wanted to say this. That I regret it. And that, if you can ever forgive me." We stood there for an unmeasured amount of time. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound in that room filled with memories. I looked at her and saw not the daughter who betrayed me, but the woman who had also been hurt by her own cowardice. Because those who hurt also destroy themselves inside. And she was destroyed. "Claire," he said, his voice breaking. "Forgiveness. I've already given it to you. But trust is rebuilt. And presence isn't just being there. It's choosing every day not to hurt again the one you swore to love." She nodded silently. She didn't try to argue. She just cried again, but this time it was different. It was the cry of someone who understood. When he got up, he walked slowly to the door. Before leaving, he turned to me and said, "Emily wants to see you. She misses you every day." My chest tightened, but this time in a good way. Because, in the midst of it all, there was something that could still blossom. Something that hadn't been tainted. My relationship with my granddaughter. The girl who grew up listening to me tell stories and now wanted to know the real one. I closed the door slowly. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, feeling the echo of what had just happened. It wasn't an outburst. It was a surrender. And, in a way, it was also a new beginning. I knew that from then on everything would be different. And that, after so long of silence, it was my turn to decide how that story would continue to be told. The next morning arrived with a different light. It wasn't the sun itself, it was the same, shy behind the clouds, as usual. But something inside me had become clear. After everything, the discoveries, the escape, the imposed silence, the pain of being betrayed by the one I carried in my arms. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. But not a peace made of forced silence or empty forgiveness. I wanted a peace with roots. The kind that grows after a great storm, when the earth is still damp from so much crying, but ready to blossom. That's why I sat at the table, in that same chair where I'd written shopping lists and silent prayers, and began to draft my decision. A portion of the inheritance I'd recovered, not all of it, but enough to make a splash in the right place, would be destined for something that reflected what I'd learned, a home for the elderly who have nowhere else to go. A space where no one would be treated as leftovers, as burdens, as shadows. A place where people could be seen before they disappeared. I spoke with Pastor Michael, of course. He helped me find the right project. Not a big name with gold plaques, but a simple home run by real people. People who serve tea with the same patience they listen to repeated stories. People who still understand that aging is a sacred process, not a social inconvenience. I insisted that the donation be anonymous to the public, but registered in the correct name. His, the man with whom I built my life. It was because of his responsibility, his simple wisdom, that there was still something to donate. He never liked to be seen. But he always made a point of caring. So, with steady hands, steadier than I thought I'd have, I wrote a letter. Not to Claire. Not to Dovey. Not even to the court. The letter was for Emily. The granddaughter who grew up listening to my stories and who, even surrounded by lies, kept room for longing. Because deep down, she always knew. Children know when love is real. I put everything in a blue envelope, her favorite color, and wrote in large letters. To be read when you want to understand who your real grandmother is. Inside, I didn't tell her the details of what happened. That wasn't important to her now. What mattered was the essence. Emily, I don't know when you'll open this letter. It could be tomorrow, it could be 10 years from now. But I write because I know that, sooner or later, we need truth. Not truth as a weapon, but truth as a mirror. I want you to know that, even when I was pushed away, even when my name was distorted, I never stopped loving you. Never. You'll hear versions. Some painful, others unfair. But what I want to leave you with isn't a ready-made answer. It's a choice, to be honest. Honesty is expensive, my daughter. Sometimes it costs your family. But it's the only path that allows you to sleep peacefully with your head on the pillow. Why legacy to you is not money. It's discernment, it's the courage to be honest, even when it isolates you, it's the strength to hold your head up high, even when they try to shame you for something you didn't do. It is knowing that the justice of men fails, but the justice of God is never late. You may even be forgotten by men, but you will never be ignored by God. I signed with my shaky but confident handwriting. And as I folded the paper, I felt as if I were closing a cycle, not of pain, but of awareness. Because everything I experienced wasn't in vain. It wasn't just my story. It was a portrait of so many other women who gave everything, were forgotten, and yet survived with dignity. I no longer have time to waste on resentment. Life is too short for that. But long enough to leave a trail that matters. And if that trail can be used as a beacon for someone who feels small, forgotten, invisible, then it was all worth it. Because the greatest legacy we can leave doesn't fit in safes. It fits in character, in example, in the silence that speaks, and in the faith that sustains even when the ground disappears. There are still decisions to be made, encounters to be had, stories to be aligned. But today I know my voice hasn't been silenced. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be heard, clearly, courageously, truthfully. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, truly. Telling this story wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And if, at some point, you saw yourself in me, in my doubts, in my quiet strength, in my will to turn things around even when everything seemed lost, then I've already gained more than justice. I've gained companionship. If this video touched you in any way, if it made you rethink a relationship or remind you of someone who deserves to hear their truth, subscribe to the channel. This is what this space is for us to share what we feel, what we learn, what we overcome. And tell me here in the comments, write "This message was for me," just so I know you stayed until the end, that our connection went beyond the screen. This strengthens me, encourages me, and most of all, shows that truth always finds shelter in some heart. If you found this conversation valuable, please leave a like. This will help the video reach those who also need to hear this story, perhaps even more than you realize. And look, there's a video right here that complements this topic. Stay with me there. Just click and follow this journey. We still have a lot to experience together.